Cryptological aspects of ESP, previously confidential. These are publicly available on the CIA CREST library. They are declassified. Some are declassified in parts. This says sanitized, copy approved for release, 2011, month 12, day 1. These letters here, NSA-RDP 96X00790R 0001-0003-0008-7 is a CIA document of an NSA document. So there's no, I'm not sure how it was acquired, or excuse me, if the CIA acquired it, simply by passing along information. But to reiterate, cryptological aspects of ESP. Extrasensory perception and telekinesis, the ComSat threat. A brief intro. The bulk of the attached report was written at a time before extrasensory perception, ESP in parentheses with an asterisk, had been established as a phenomenon worthy of scientific inquiry. Since that time, the American Association for the Advancement of Science has accepted parapsychology as a legitimate branch of science. Double asterisk. Significant developments took place in 1972 at the Stanford Research Institute, in parentheses SRI, comma, where psychic Uri Geller was tested in guessing experiments involving dice. During the many randomized tests, whenever Mr. Geller said that he could guess the number on the dice correctly, he was able to do so. Ingo Swann and other physics tested by SRI demonstrated the ability to describe distant rooms they had never previously observed with considerable accuracy. From 1970 to 1974, Mr. Clive Baxter, a polygrapher, and other American researchers, as well as Soviet researchers, discovered that the bond between men and plants was often so close that the plant would respond automatically whenever the man was injured. It was as if the man and the plant had become a single organism. What affected the person seemed to also affect the plant instantly. In ESP occurrences between persons, this uniting bond, asterisk, seemed to be the primary factor permitting the ESP effect. It also appeared that some persons could bond readily and deeply with other persons or objects. This bonding was often followed by the acquisition of insightful information available from no other sensory or logical source. The advent of groups devoted to psychic or insightful gifts has indicated that groups of mutually supportive ESP seekers can achieve a greater degree of sensitivity than the interested person can achieve on his own. Spontaneous events occurring in primitive societies confirms this conclusion. In 1974, mid over matter phenomenon, that should be mind, it has been corrected in the document as you see, mind over matter phenomena were given further credence by the remarkable experiments conducted by scientists Dr. Robert Miller of Georgia Institute of Technology and Dr. Philip Reinhardt of Agnes Scott College of Atlanta, Georgia. Working with psychic Mrs. Olga Wuerl, they were able to demonstrate energy effects willed by Mrs. Wuerl in a cloud chamber. This feat was reportedly performed at distances up to 600 miles away from the cloud chamber. Though more spectacular than most previous experiments, this latest work only tended to confirm what researchers like Dr. DRS period Hans Bender of Germany and Sergeyev of Russia had also found, that some people could emit energy of an unknown type which could move objects or interfere with electronic equipment. Such effects were more often spontaneous than intentional. The effect was usually directly related to the intensity of frustration experienced by an individual. So let me just read a couple of the asterisks here. So the first one, for ESP. See glossary of terms on page 8 of the attached report, and then double asterisk significant developments. This took place at the AAAS meeting on 27 December 1968. So that's December 1968. Even though this document was released in 1973, I don't see an origin date for the document just yet. There could be one. So a couple things which are interesting right off the bat. In ESP occurrences between persons, this uniting bond, see glossary, seemed to be the primary factor permitting the ESP effect. So there's really, initially, I think, the bond, this uniting bond, the presumption that this wasn't already there to begin with in everybody, right? That there had to be some sort of uniting bond. And I could be misunderstanding the context of the writer or the author's meaning or intent, but the uniting bond is often referenced as the ether or the aether, which exists around everybody. Some people might say it's the magnetic resonance of the planet or people in general. That's probably true. As I go through a lot of these documents and sort of make correlations based on current and contemporary technologies, as well as current and contemporary resources available via these same declassified documents, including research, I'm going to start to make some more contemporary connections with pop culture and stuff like that. So, for example, this bonding was often followed by the acquisition of insightful information available from no other sensory source. Spontaneous events occurring in primitive societies confirms this conclusion. So let's go back a little bit. The effect was usually, last sentence in this one paragraph here, the effect was usually directly related to the intensity of frustration experienced by an individual. Now for me, having grown up with comic books and being a fan of the X-Men, which are humans born with gifts, latent gifts, and usually those gifts were activated during pubescence or puberty, while they were going through puberty, or at or during puberty, as well as frustration or excitable situations. So, you know, depending on when this document was released and actually written, 1960s is when the X-Men were written and introduced into the pop culture matrix I'm gonna speculate, I think it was Jack Kirby was the artist, and Stan Lee was the writer. The effect was usually directly related to the intensity of frustration experienced by an individual. So let's go back to this asterisk here, the first one on this page. I might have lost it. Okay, so maybe it's one up here. Oh, maybe it's double asterisk. The relationship theory of this unitary bond in Chapter 1 is my own sketch of this reality. I have shown to ESP researcher physicist Russell Tang that may be Russell Targ. There's some typos in here and they may be deliberate, I'm not sure. ESP researcher physicist Russell Tang for now, and discussed it with Professor Merthaler of Catholic University, a theologian. These and others of different fields have said that it was a good insight. So I think it's interesting with this note here that we are instantly introduced to a physicist and what's most likely a Catholic priest or a Catholic theologian, as it's referenced here, considering that a number of what's called sacred geometry or sacred texts or mystery schools or sacred schools and things like that were often confiscated by the Catholic Church, as well as, I think, most famously, the average person knowing that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed and burned to the ground, allegedly. Excuse me. This is my first audio, guys, so I have a bit of a dry throat. I've been working all day in the sun. I'll drink a little bit here. So next page, we're on ComSec threat underlined. Although at present only a very few persons are measurably gifted with ESP, the threat implications to ComSec are profound. This is true because studies of primitive people indicate that general ESP ability level within a society does fluctuate in accordance with the emphasis placed on the subject by the society. I'm going to stop there. That's interesting. So this is true because studies of primitive people indicate that general ESP ability level within a society does fluctuate in accordance with the emphasis placed on the subject of the society or by the society. I'm going to paraphrase that with my own interpretation. That basically means if enough people believe in it, it manifests. And it manifests not because they made it happen, but because it was there and they activated it through the belief in the manifestation itself. So next paragraph. Our present society is quite interested in this subject, and many ESP study and development groups have formed throughout the United States. The anticipated growth in ESP utilization not only threatens the security of the U.S. and friendly nations' communications, but the whole security structure, which relies so heavily on the ability to compartment and protect need to know. The person with highly developed ESP capabilities can disregard need to know, and few would probably be the wiser until it was too late. The psychic would probably not concern himself with guessing most cryptographic keys, but would attack the plain text directly, either in the mind of the communicators or the originators or in the plain text printed message. Uri Geller's reported performance with guessing dice seems to be more of a threat to small cryptographic materials such as nuclear command and control authenticators. With the advent of increased telekinetic ability, direct and subtle attacks against computers and computerized ciphers becomes a troublesome eventuality. With their high-level stress factor, command and control centers become particularly vulnerable to such attacks. So, while I understand that the CIA and the NSA are, I believe the CIA is a federal entity. It is not an entity of the people. The NSA is a military entity closely aligned with the Navy, I believe, as it's also supported directly and has control and authority directly over the Marines, I think the Air Force, and I think the Navy. So I don't know if it's direct control, but I know that they are supported by them, whereas the CIA is not. They have to make requests, and I think the CIA is more closely involved with the Department of Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the DIA. It's interesting that right off the bat we go into fear. We don't go into manifestation, utilization, education, or anything like that. I have read this document twice, so if I stumble over words, it's just because I'm going into more depth and also trying to supplement what I read out loud with my interpretation and commentary on top of that after I'm done reading. Someone could also download this and just terminate and cut out all that my suppositional text and summarizations. So with the advent of increased telekinetic ability, discrete and subtle attacks against computers and computerized ciphers becomes a troublesome eventuality. So there's nothing in here that really shows that could happen. Some of the other documents that I might read going forward, it's later called psychokinesis or PK events, and I do believe that those are real. I've experienced some when I was younger. Another reason why I'll go through this stuff later. Let me move to the next page. Or another reason I'll go through some of the other documents later and then try to make correlations between everything here. Keep in mind that as you listen to these or read these or download these for yourself, again, what you can do at the CIA CREST library, as you read these, you're going to start to see that there's a lot of obfuscation between specific details while other things are revealed openly. And then there's also obfuscation and hidden details related to who's getting what, who's receiving it, who last saw it, and things like that. So defenses underlined. Fortunately, bond, disrupting confusion, boredom, and meditation seem to provide some protection against ESP, as do certain religious practices. Unfortunately, the offensive element has been subjected to far closer scrutiny than the defensive ESP factor. Much needs to be done to test defenses against ESP. So that's a striking paragraph again, right? That's very revealing for those of you that have familiar knowledge with your religion, have familiar knowledge with a lot of religions. It should be striking to you of those who maybe be full-time consumers of content and media and pop culture and things like that. Bond disrupting confusion, right here. Boredom and meditation seem to provide some protection against ESP. So for me to add some commentary on that, bond disrupting confusion could be anything from war theater, false flags, fake news, your credit card being stolen, dealing with a child, boredom. I think that just mainly is a reflection of how often our minds all wander and how they're sort of alluding to the fact that we may wander into, via either a dream or a lucid daydream, discover something, and not interpret it as anything other than just a random thought, but we may discover something. I'm not sure how meditation seemed to provide some protection against ESP, unless he's actually contradicting himself here, where unfortunately the offensive element has been subjected to far closer scrutiny than the defensive, because meditation would imply that the mind is being used to defend itself against other ESP people. Much needs to be done to test defenses against ESP. So for me, a takeaway, again, I have a larger knowledge base, having read multiple documents related to this stuff, that the confusion and boredom, that comes from everyday work. Anybody that's got a job or has a sense of responsibility outside of literally being able to sit there and daydream all day. Someone's got to drive, someone's got to lift stuff, someone's got to move stuff, someone who has to put stuff together. Some parents, responsible parents. This mass chaos and confusion that we often see all the time, everywhere, is, in my mind, again, reading other documents, having some knowledge against these documents, with these documents in mind, seems to be part of the defensive mechanism. I find this sentence interesting here, the end of it, after the comma, as do certain religious practices. For me, that immediately correlates with occultism. That would also immediately correlate with abuse in multiple forms, what we call shock and awe, or I guess mind-based trauma would be another way to reference it, or through the often literal interpretation of a lot of religious practices, really conflating the readers or the religious believers' understanding of themselves by forcing them into a paradigm of knowledge that is sort of codifying the actual religious practices. That's sort of a sad thought, because in most cases you find people who are devoutly religious to be generally well-rounded people, despite whatever their religious practices are. No matter how fundamental their beliefs are, there's always a very good and positive side to everything they believe. So I find that to be a very concerning sentence. Let's move on to the next paragraph here. Psychology and ethics. As you will soon note, the subject of ESP does not lend itself easily to the simple, logical, direct approach. I'm not sure how I would note that. The basic reason for this is that ESP is an effect arising from the deepest level of the human being. At this central reality where man is at one with all of reality, the various fields of human knowledge also become one concern. ESP cannot be treated simply as a psychological phenomenon, or a physical reality, or just a powerful talent, or only an ethical concern. The story of Pandora's box is an excellent analogy of the emergence of ESP into the life of man. We cannot be so selective that we let out only the ESP portion of the deep consciousness. When the lid is lifted, the monsters of the id also emerge, and with them the sanctity of Francis, or Teresa, or Avila. It is no coincidence that the first modern head of state to dedicate himself to the use of ESP powers was also the man partially responsible for unleashing the most unspeakable horrors upon the earth, Adolf Hitler. ESP used by a cadre of unscrupulous or unsensitive men would not only make a shambles of our need-to-know structure, but also threaten the state with great malignancy. These powers cannot be ignored, but only men of wholeness, of high moral development, should be encouraged to develop such gifts and allowed to use them in government. It ought not to be forgotten that Menninger Institute researchers, also as well as noted parapsychologists, have warned us that the occupational hazards of ESP research is a virulent form of mental illness. Let's take this real quick, because that last sentence there is a little confusing. It ought not to be forgotten that Menninger Institute researchers, as well as noted parapsychologists, have warned us that the occupational hazard of ESP research is a virulent form of mental illness. Occupational hazard of ESP research is a mental illness. Let's look at that. John Peterson, Science and Psychic Power, The National Observer, 20th of October, 1973. I'm not going to go back there. Let's start from the top here. Look, little social commentary. Psychology and ethics. As you will soon note, the subject does not lend itself easily to the simple, logical, direct approach. That would not be so difficult, and actually would not be true if people were not bombarded with counterintuitive knowledge and misdirection constantly throughout their lives. So really, the issue is actually the cure or the defense, which may be deliberate. The basic reason for this is that ESP is in effect rising from the deepest level of the human being. That sounds more spiritual than it should be. I think as I go through a lot of these, you'll see that physicists actually have tracked, monitored, and correlated the actual waves of energy that we both expound mentally and harness biologically. So I guess you could reverse that as well, which would be expound biologically and harness mentally. I guess it would work both ways. I find this Pandora's box here, again, a little bit of fear porn. This statement about unspeakable horrors upon the earth, Adolf Hitler. You know, I think anybody that's watching this or somehow is able to watch this, I don't know how censored this will be, but there's enough evidence to completely refute that last statement there. I mean, the FBI has interviews on VHS tape that refute that. The Red Cross would refute that. Poland would concurrently refute that. So ESP used by a cadre of unscrupulous or sensitive men would not only make shambles of our need-to-know structure. So, well, I mean, if it's a need-to-know structure, you know, I think there's a famous quote that a lot of people use in reference to Google, where at one point they said, if you don't want anybody knowing what you're doing, don't do anything wrong. Secrecy does not provide security. I think that's been proven over and over again. I'm sure there's enough research for other people to check that out, but at no point does secrecy provide absolute security. In fact, I think most of the evidence that exists today in 2019 has proven that secrecy does not provide security in any matter, whether you're using the states and federal government's secret weapons to identify crime, or if the state and secret groups, secret agency groups, are compromised from within by their own people, which is often the case. Most likely it's not really the average person's fault. If anything, what happens is the average person, based on what they're saying up here, figures something out on their own and then makes an attempt to let other people know or to find out more about it, and then they are immediately shut down, probably stalked, and this whole disruption confusion mechanism begins. Let me take another drink, excuse me. So I'm going to keep going here. Conclusion, underlined. The attached report contains actually several reports written over the past 10 years. Because there is little understanding of this new field and much resistance to it, many pages are expended in describing the nature of the phenomena. The longest portion of the study surveys some significant research in the field to establish the legitimacy of the ESP concern. This is a foundation study, an exploratory study. There are few certainties and no tidy conclusions. From the fearful experiences some government researchers have had, perhaps we have learned that we are too immature to deal appropriately with such phenomena. In conversation with some talented cryptanalysts, it has become apparent that NSA has made use of ESP for years. That's interesting. I missed that in my previous reading. The gifted analyst admitted that when they are unable to develop an effective attack biological process, they perform a kind of mental switching to a higher unitary way of thinking. This is often symbolized in dreams. By this new way of thinking, information is gained for which there is which there is not really a logical explanation. Perhaps the best and most appropriate approach NSA could use in dealing with this phenomena in-house would be to identify such talented analysts so that they can be used in teams on especially difficult problems. Otherwise, it may be best for the time being not to engage in ESP development experiments within the NSA, but a close watch needs to be kept on developments in the field. Although where talented psychics are involved in experiments, it is best, for security reasons, that parties not knowledgeable in current NSA classified projects be used as observers. So right away, again, we go into the fear, the alarming. I think it's interesting that, right off the bat for me, it's the NSA that was doing this and has already used it and been using it for years. It's my understanding that both the CIA and the NSA were founded and created on the remnants of what's called the OSS, which was founded and created on the remnants of German scientists and physicists. So while this paper makes a condemnation of Hitler, most of this research is actually predicated on that research. I'm just reviewing some of this real quick. I'll skip this for now. This is often symbolized in dreams. I think that's interesting right there. The mental switching to a higher unitary way of thinking. You're going to find out in some other documents that they have actually figured out how to do that. I'm not going to say that it's drugs, but it is a form of drugging. Although drugs, obviously, those who have used drugs and recreationally or have taken large doses of many drugs recreationally understand what a higher state of consciousness means. It doesn't mean better necessarily. It doesn't mean worse, but I think we can make that mental switching correlation as well with those, the pharmacological industry as well. Suggestions to the reviewer. That's us, guys and girls. Gals, I guess. Gals is more appropriate, guys and gals. Because few people are conversant with the field of parapsychology, the report contains much foundation and explanatory material. If the reviewer is aware of the nature of ESP, of scientific work in the field, and of Soviet bloc research, I suggest he concentrate only on the introduction chapters 1, 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 6 is a unique cryptographic experimental study designed by the Arthur with Professional Review. Table of contents. So that was an introduction. The table of contents, introduction. A description and experimental study of the cryptological aspects of ESP. Chapter 1. Extrasensory perception. primary communication in parentheses, and explanatory observation of the nature and structure of psi, PSI in capital letters. Chapter 2, how to safely develop ESP through the organism, type, the believing community. Chapter 3, ESP, a threat to ComSec, a survey of open literature. Chapter 4, ESP, a special report on Soviet research. Chapter 5, Soviet bloc science and parapsychology. Chapter 6, testing for the cryptological aspects of ESP, an initial report. Chapter 7, the potential threat of PK to ComSec. Chapter 8, defense against ESP. Summary, glossary of terms, page 8. Appendix at end of chapters, bibliography at end of chapters. So there's 97 pages in total. I think chapter 4 is interesting if you haven't read anything yet related to any of this stuff or have no information with it. A special report on Soviet research. There is, they have been studying it far longer and openly. And then chapter 2, how to safely develop ESP through the organism, the believing community. So if we're not believers, but still exhibited these traits and these talents, they would have to create a mechanism to defend against those people, correct? I mean, that's the understanding here. That would be the corollary or the opposite or the inversion of this kind of system, this belief, these I guess just this summarization of the table of contents. So I'm going to stop this here for the first, I guess, audio session of declassified documents. I think I'm just going to call this declassified, and just as I read these out, I got to figure out a process to not offer commentary on top of everything. However, it's difficult to make correlations to existing documents after reading for half an hour or an hour and expect you, the listener, to know where to go or to maintain a train of thought regarding all this information. Those of you that can listen and read at the same time and actually memorize it and commit it to memory pretty quick, that's great, but I don't have that ability. I can speed read fairly well, but it doesn't commit to memory because I'm reading with a different goal in mind, sort of like searching for metadata. So with that, I'm going to cut this one short and end it at 33 minutes.